We'll get started very soon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. You can grab some water or a snack if you need it. We'll start in a few minutes. Thanks for joining. We'll start in about 1 minute. All right, everyone, it is time for us to get started. So welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2023 webinar, Increasing Art, Health, and Wealth in Trauma-Affected Communities. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. So we can go over to the next slide. So before we begin the webinar, please take a moment to review the Zoom feature so that you can have an optimal experience with us today. If you have any technical questions during the webinar, you can look through the attendees list, the panelist list for any name that starts with LGC Tech. And you can send a personal message, a direct message to one of those folks, and they will help you out with your tech question. Otherwise, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen for questions that are directed to the presenters. So that's kind of how we're keeping things organized here. And if you would like to receive captioning for the presentation, you can select the CC feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and click Show Subtitles, and you will receive captioning. Okay, so the arts impact on health and well-being can be seen at all stages of life. And our GIA membership, and specifically the 2022 GIA Support for Individual Artist Committee members, have spent a considerable amount of time and discussion around the wellness needs of individual artists in the midst of crisis and beyond. And these conversations have been elevated to members of the National Organization for Arts and Health, or NOAA, in consideration of how funders can continue to be collaborative around intersectional arts and health support for individual artists, arts organizations, and more broadly, increase access to the arts in trauma-affected communities, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So we're still seeking to address the following questions. So what are the approaches or the various approaches that funders can take to supporting intersectional arts and health initiatives in trauma-affected communities? And how can this be done sensitively given the nature of this work? So we'll have some presentations, we'll get into a dialogue today, and then we'll get some questions from you. But the folks who will be the stars of this dialogue, sharing their incredible insights and bringing all of their knowledge to this conversation are none other than Christina Eskridge, founder and executive director of Elevate Theatre Company LLC and board secretary of the National Organization for Arts and Health. We also have Rick Luftglass, executive director of the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund, and Susan Magsamen, founder and executive director of International Arts and Minds Lab within the Center for Applied Neuroaesthetics. So we are going to get right into this presentation. We are so excited, and I will kick it over to you, Susan, to get us started.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be here with my colleagues. Really wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. I think what I'll do is maybe begin by just giving you a little bit of information about the work that we do at the lab. So as you heard, I'm at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm part of something called the International Arts and Mind Lab. And our work is really at the intersection of brain science and the arts and aesthetic experience. We're interested in accelerating this field that's emerging called neuroaesthetics or neuroarts. And our goal in the lab is really to amplify human potential through the arts and aesthetic experience. So just a couple of things to level set. In our lab, we do research, primarily translational research. We're really interested in this idea of research to practice in a highly interdisciplinary generative environment. We also work in field leadership, and we've developed some models of how to study the arts in this translational way. And I'll talk about the NeuroArts Blueprint in a moment. This fall, we'll be having a gathering called Intentional Spaces, which looks at the role of arts and space and how we really can bring researchers and practitioners and technologists together. We work in community building and also in outreach and education. So I want to speak to you about the NeuroArts Blueprint primarily today. This is work that started in 2019. We became partners with the Aspen Institute, who are really fabulous partners in bringing people from all over the world together to really explore a topic. And for us, it's in health, well-being, and learning. And what we were able to do with them is talk with people, thousands of people all over the world for 2 years to really understand where the arts were in their community and how they were being used. And most importantly, not only what the opportunities were, but what the challenges were. And coming out of that, we created something called the NeuroArts Blueprint. And the goal of the blueprint is to ensure that the arts and the use of the arts in all of its many forms become part of mainstream medicine and public health. Now, that's a very big order. But what we saw in bringing people together was the enormous synergy and energy that was really behind this idea of creating a field, a brand new field like bioethics or women's health or even climate change, where you bring highly interdisciplinary groups together to really solve big problems. And that's really where this work lies. So the blueprint is so just to define what we mean by neuroarts, because I think that's important as a force multiplier. Neuroarts is really the study of how arts and aesthetic experiences measurably change the brain, body, and behavior, and how this knowledge can be translated into specific practices to advance health and well-being. So this idea of being able to find generative ways to be able to study this work and bring it forward is really only been emerging in the last 20 years as we've been able to use technology to understand more about the neurobiology and the physiology of the arts. There we are. So just to go a little deeper into that, What we talk about in terms of research is this idea around ways of knowing. So some folks might think, oh, well, research means basic science research. It means molecular, cellular research. And yes, that is certainly part of what we do. But we're also really interested in the many ways that we know. So the way that artists know as artists, but also as arts educators or arts practitioners, the way we generalize knowledge around things like experiments or theories or logic models, around practical knowledge and lived experience. And this idea of foundational knowledge, which can be ancestral, it can be indigenous, it can come from experimentation in a natural setting. So we really try to hold space in the blueprint for all these different ways of knowing and come up with ways to bring those together to really address some of these very intractable issues that we've been looking at through the arts and aesthetic experiences. The blueprint has 5 recommendations, and I want to briefly go through those. The first is to strengthen the research foundation. The second is to honor and support the practitioners. The third is to expand and enrich educational and career pathways. And as I think many folks know, educational pathways can be limited, and there also can be no real sustainable way to build revenue and an economic model for a sustainable career pathway. To advocate for sustainable funding, and that's public and private partnerships. So that's really important, and to really look at how to promote these effective policies so that they become sustainable. And then the last is looking at capacity building, leadership, and also communication strategies. And those strategies are for all different stakeholders. So when I think about that, I think about arts practitioners, researchers, but also policymakers, funders, and of course, the general public, where I think we're just now beginning to explore and explain this intersection of the arts and how the arts affect our physiology and our psychology. And this is a book that was mentioned earlier that I wrote with Ivy Ross, who is the vice president of hardware design at Google. And we started this book in 2019, about the same time that the blueprint started. And we started it because we really believed that while the work of the blueprint is so critical, it's going to take a couple of years, 5 to 10 years, to really make this field a reality. Yet there's so much of what we know already that can be used today, is shovel ready. So the book really blends research and arts practitioner stories with practical ways to use the arts in health, well-being, learning, flourishing, and community building. And so in the blueprint, we really look at 3 different ways to build this work. One is evidence, the second is infrastructure, and the third is community. And just very briefly, this slide that's coming up, there we go, shows you, and we have 3 phases. The first phase is really prioritizing these different areas. So we are working on economic analyses and foundational white papers. At the core of what we're doing in the first 2 years is building a neuroarts resource center. And that is really, think of it as a watering hole where we can come together, all of us, regardless of our disciplines, our fields, our country, age, race, gender, to really learn from each other. And that work is very much underway and will be shared at the end of this calendar year as the first phase of the build in the resource center. We're also building, really importantly, community coalitions. And these are hyper-local community organizations, as well as cultural arts organizations, research programs in an individual community. And right now we're piloting 3. One is in New York City, Kansas City, and Palm Beach, with another 3 on the way, to really put together the framework for a toolkit where communities all over the world can really use this work to build stronger hyper-local communities. And then the last is in community building, where we are working on a number of things, including an awards program that Renee Fleming just announced, which is looking to fund young investigators with artists. And that we'll be sharing more about that in the coming months. NeuroArts Resource Center I talked a bit about. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go deep into this other than to say we see this as a place where everyone can get the resources they need to bring them back to their community. And community arts coalitions, as I mentioned, are really this idea of hyper-local programs where there are toolkits for best practices, and most importantly, being able to connect communities to communities through networking and collaboration pathways. And with that, I will say thank you. Oh, and I, with my apologies, I'm now turning it over to Rick Luftglass.
Actually, I think I'm next, Susan.
Yes,
Christina.
you're
Yeah.
next.
Oh,
Take it away, Christina.
sorry, Christina.
All good, all good. Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Eskridge. I am very excited to be here and grateful for the opportunity to talk about the many different organizations and types of organizations and individuals that are a part of the arts and health world. As we know, this is a really vast and diverse field. And so today I'm going to be representing 3 different organizations that have different purviews or perspectives on arts and health, just to give some idea of the variety that is underneath this umbrella. I'm sure all of you have different perspectives and organizations that you're affiliated with. So these are just 3 examples of what's in our vast field. First is the National Organization for Arts and Health. I serve as the secretary for our membership organization. Our mission is to unite, advance, and serve the entire field of arts and health. We have over 500 members nationwide, and we provide a variety of services, publications, research opportunities, and events. Our members get the benefit of over 24 events each year, as well as our annual conference, which is a really exciting opportunity. I would love for folks to put one of our folks to put the link to NOAA in the chat, so that if you would like to dive a little bit deeper and learn more about our annual conference or our membership opportunities, we'd really love to have you join us. NOAA also has a focus on professionalization, making sure that those currently in the arts and health field, in healthcare specifically, so artists, arts administrators, et cetera, in healthcare, have an opportunity to really expand their knowledge and have a foundational understanding of what the field entails, as well as what they can bring to their employer. So I encourage you to take a look at NOAA. Again, membership organization, really broad strokes, trying to advocate, unite, and advance the field of arts and health. Next, I represent Elevate Theatre Company. I am the executive director and founder, and we're creating space for artists and audiences to explore health and well-being through the art of storytelling. And this is really an organization that's looking at public health. All of our shows are public health in nature, looking at a particular topic, and then we fuse that with public health professionals who are experts in that particular field, allowing our audience to dive deeper through storytelling and theater, through workshops, as well as consulting. Finally, the One Nation, One Project is a multifaceted intervention that is modeled after the Federal Theater Project. It's a participatory arts engagement opportunity for different cities across the US to explore the creative prompt, No Place Like Home. We also have a research engagement that is asking the question, how does arts participation impact social cohesion and therefore well-being? Thanks for adding those links into the chat. These 3 organizations are different in their organizational structure, different in the way they're serving the field, have different perspectives. NOAA, again, is membership driven and trying to serve those who are in this field. Elevate is looking at public health themes and topics. And One Nation, One Project is bringing together municipalities, public health, and artists to drive health and well-being in a variety of locations across the US. Now, we know that the arts are proven to have impact on health and well-being, reduction in chronic pain, reduce risk of depression, potentially increasing civic engagement, and maybe even reducing, creating cost savings. Susan just talked about, the impact on our bodies and our brains, et cetera. And the study of that. But when we think about the professionals in this field and what they might need from funders and supporters, there are three things that I've identified that really have an opportunity to help expand those who have access to funding across this very vast field. The first is easy to find sustainable funding. The second is expanding the definition of impact. Susan also talked about ways of knowing, right? So having impact be something a little bit broader than just the number of widgets or the outcome. And finally, recognition of the varied organizational structures that exist within this vast field. So just to dive slightly deeper into each one of these, easy to find sustainable sources. Many of the organizations, individuals, and collective artists that are working with trauma impacted communities or any community, they're really focused on their meaningful programming, and their bandwidth can be limited to find sources to support their current operations. So making sure that funding sources are available and widespread, making sure that they're sustainable, multi-year opportunities as opposed to just today. And then also, I find that as artists, individual artists have experience with success in their ability to gain access to funding, they're more likely to try again. So having the availability of feedback should funding not be available or not be granted to an individual or a collective or an institution, et cetera, is really valuable so that that perseverance and that resilience can continue bringing folks back to the opportunities that are there. Again, expanding our definition of impact. Impact looks different in different communities. Not everything is about the numbers or about the number of people. Sometimes, especially when we're talking of trauma impacted communities or trauma affected communities, the numbers are, sometimes it's about process, not so much about product or outcome. It's about the availability of the arts to build that resilience and those qualities that we are looking for in healthy communities. And also professionalization. This is where NOAA comes in, right? Making sure that we have those arts therapists connected with arts and health professionals, connected with the hospital setting or the public health setting or the community health setting. So that way everyone can work together to expand that definition of impact. And I think, as Susan mentioned, the work that she's doing is really helping to identify some of those opportunities where professionals can come together and expand that definition. And then finally, this varied organizational structure, having funders keep in mind that not everyone is a nonprofit. Some are individual artists or small collectives. There's LLCs, there's nonprofits, of course, but then there's others who are fiscally sponsored, who are tied to academic institutions, et cetera. So there's lots of different ways that we are organizing ourselves under the umbrella of arts and health and having an opportunity to seek funding, seek support, seek engagement across sectors beyond just the nonprofit model is a very helpful opportunity as well. So with that, I'd just like to say, please check out each of these organizations. Again, they represent very different perspectives and views of the arts and health field. NOAA has a conference coming up, have to shout that out. Elevate Theatre Company has programming that's online for you to view today. And One Nation, One Project is coming out with new information all the time on our Instagram page and our other social media channels. So this interdisciplinary field really requires a varied approach when it comes to the support, the funding, and the engagement that we encounter. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Rick because we're going to talk more about funding. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Really glad to be a part of today's session with Susan and Christina, and I appreciate GIA's leadership in this field and the field of intersecting the growth around arts and health. My name is Rick Luftglass. I'm Executive Director of the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund. We are a family foundation in New York City led by Laurie M. Tisch, as you would be able to deduce. And Laurie is very active in a number of organizations and very active in the foundation. And so we have a very, very good partnership that enables us to develop exciting new programs. I am going to move forward. Okay, so our mission for the foundation is increase access and opportunity for all New Yorkers. On the one hand, that's very broad. Because it's not wedded to a particular issue. On the other hand, it's very narrow because it's geographically focused and it's very much around disparities and inequities. About 5 years ago, we decided to develop a new initiative around the intersection between arts and health. We were seeing a lot of activity going on and saw opportunities, gaps, and trends. As we looked at the field, it is very broad, these intersections. It can range from, bedside programs to the kinds of programs like that we just heard about from Christina. And the areas we found was sort of a space for opportunity for impact was around 3 areas: mental health stigma, mental health trauma, and aging-related diseases. We also have been working at around professional healthcare provider burnout. And as we looked at the field nationally and internationally, we really brought it home to say, what's going on nationally? How does it apply to our mission? How do we find that nexus with focus on New York City, particularly around disparities and focusing on individuals and communities? We started with about 15 grantees across those 3 areas. And there's sort of a typology of programs that focus on individuals, whether it's like a patient or a client or an individual participant on something like Dance for PD with Parkinson's, or Arts and Minds for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Then there are those that are more community-based, which are dealing with issues of, for example, collective trauma and experiences that affect particular populations. And then social issues, what I really mean is sort of societal in terms of mental health stigma, for example, is not an issue that is localized, but that we experience it at every level. So some of these programs crossed over. In 2021, because of COVID, we decided to hone in on mental health, and specifically, as we know, the disparities in hospitalization and deaths affected specific communities disproportionately. What we saw is the mental health fallout also is affecting disproportionately. We decided to focus on arts organizations serving specific communities and populations that were disproportionately affected. We held our first open call. Typically, we identify partners. This was the first time we really opened it up. And the criteria, as you'll see, targeted populations, specific challenges that were affected by the pandemic, and very, and while you can say any arts program has therapeutic value, we were really looking at sort of an intentionality about the mental health strategies that comes through either the kinds of programs or the partners that are being brought to the table. We identified about 14 organizations out of submission about 115. And I'm not going to go into each one because I'll give you a little bit of a case study on common threads. But these are deal with issues like formerly incarcerated youth, formerly homeless, refugees, survivors of domestic violence, communities of color in various ways, and some specifically focused on artists and artists of color. As we look at impact, and this gets to what Christina was saying, we look at what do the organizations define as impact, and it may be around a particular intervention or initiative or organizational goals. And then we see 4 areas that transcend any individual organization. And so we look at sort of those commonalities. And so some examples are increased access that one of the grantees, Indie Space, which subsidizes therapy for BIPOC artists, performing artists, has subsidized 543 artists to receive therapy. Partnerships range from across organizations to those with public sector agencies. And then through the process of well, this kind of webinar, for example, articles, webinars, ways to go outside of the organization itself and share that knowledge. And then the leadership pipeline. And then what do we do as a foundation to knit this all together? And that is convening our grantees, connecting them to each other, supporting them with communications, building a field. And one example, since we've talked about NOAA, is that we are supporting about 20 of the organizations and sending staff members to the NOAA conference in Cleveland this year. So those of you who come to NOAA will see. So one program, Common Threads, I'll just turn it over to the video. Is the video going to run?
At Common Threads Project, we accompany women and girls on their healing journey from sexual violence, war, and displacement. We have developed a unique methodology for this process. In our programs in Ecuador, Nepal, Bosnia, and Eastern Congo, we have witnessed a miraculous capacity for resilience and growth. Even in the most challenging contexts, recovery is possible. Our work is inspired by the ancient tradition of making story cloths that is found in so many different cultures. We know that our deepest human experiences seem to defy words. So in many contexts throughout history, women have come together to sew their unspeakable stories as a way of being understood. We combine this practice with current trauma therapies to achieve profound and lasting recovery. We work in collaboration with local community organizations. Common Threads Project trains local practitioners who adapt the program so that it is culturally resonant. They lead the healing circles, and we mentor them as they gain expertise. In a Common Thread circle, there is a sense of intimate connection with others. Within the safety of the group, we work where trauma lives, in the body and in visual images. The stitching itself is calming, rhythmic, and meditative. Like trauma work, the story cloth happens at a slow pace. It takes time and patience.
So why are we working internationally? We're actually not. Common Threads has brought their program to New York, and through our funding, they have started with 2 organizations in partnership, Sanctuary for Families and the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture, and serving refugee communities and survivors of gender-based violence and torture here, typically as a result of war and displacement. We have an exhibit currently in our office, one of the ways we help amplify the work of our grantees, and I will invite anyone who's in New York to come see the exhibit. Just email us at info@lmtif.org, and we'll be able to facilitate a time. I am over time, so I'm going to move very quickly to our other partnership, which is New York City Health and Hospitals, which is the public hospital system, works across the city. And we work with the Arts and Medicine program, which has multiple components, including, as I talked about, the caregivers. I'll jump to this during the conversation. Susan knows very well about the community mural project, so I'll put it in that context. And meanwhile, we can turn it back to Sherilyn.
All right, thank you so much, Rick. Yeah, there's a lot more to share, and we'll get into that during our discussion. And for those of you who are like, but I really wanted to see the slides, we're sending the slides after, not to worry, we will get there. But yes, I'm excited to invite our panelists back into this space so we can get into a discussion together. Your presentations were great, and I think that folks who are here have a much stronger sense of the lens that you're bringing into this discussion. So for starters, you've all kind of touched on this a little bit, but just to kind of level things off for folks to understand, we continue to talk about trauma affected and what that means. We can remove the slides for now.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no worries. You're fine.
Okay.
We talk about trauma affected, and as you were all speaking, I've heard kind of different meanings to that. And so it's kind of like a large, runs the gamut, I guess, when we're thinking of trauma affected. So if you could all just kind of respond to what that means for you and your work.
Wow, that's a big question. Maybe I'll just say that, I think that if you look at the both national and international statistics around anxiety, stress, PTSD, trauma, they were very high before COVID. We were seeing a lot of confluence around mental health and well-being related to political and environmental concerns, around equity and diversity, around economic issues. COVID amplified that by a multiplier of 100. And so I think that there are small micro traumas and there are large traumas. And I think some of the things that we heard Rick talk about are assaults against women. There are human trafficking, natural disasters where there are, right now we're seeing flooding in the New England area, which is absolutely devastating for communities that are really going to need immediate first responders with arts and healing, but they're also going to need long-term healing to rebuild and to really reframe their narratives. So I think as we look at it, it's also, I want to add first responders, healthcare providers, educators, anyone who is facing the public or communities that are in service of others are experiencing their own kind of trauma in terms of burnout and stress and anxiety. So I think it's a matrix of issues that I think this work beautifully addresses for prevention, protection, intervention, and I think practice.
That's great. Thanks, Susan. Rick, it looked like you were about to start speaking.
Oh, sure. So one thing, when we did the open call in 2021, we looked at the data around the issues that Susan was pointing out. For example, the trends around anxiety and depression that are tracked by the CDC. And we saw that in some populations, it leveled out. In others, it very much continued. For example, Black and Latinx communities, the rates of anxiety and depression did not go down as much. People with disabilities, it did not go down. And so we're at higher levels for specific populations. And I think trying to differentiate who has been impacted and where are those sort of residual effects or sustained effects.
Great.
I'm going to yes and all of what was already said, but really with a pinpointed emphasis on both frontline health workers and the trauma and experiences, the burnout that has been a part of that community for a very long time, as Susan mentioned, prior to COVID, but is now amplified and requires some very specific intervention in medical education, in nursing education, et cetera. And, we've at Elevate, we've really tried to focus in on that. And at NOAA, we have publications around healthcare burnout, and we've been, working to amplify some of that work as well. But then I'd also like to just highlight artists themselves, the trauma around having your livelihood stripped, especially as a performing artist, not being able to perform live and in person for 3 years or 2 years, depending on how risky or excited you were to get back out there, or how conditions allowed you to get back out there, is really a different kind of trauma than being frontline and supporting those during the pandemic. It's a loss of identity. It's a loss of your livelihood. It's a loss of your community in many cases. So thinking about the artists themselves as well as part of this discussion, I think, is really, really paramount.
Can I just add shame?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Rick mentioned shame and stigma in relating to common threads. And I think that is a common thread through all of these communities, where I think the stigma has been lifted up. And I think coming out of COVID, we are more compassionate and maybe empathetic. But stigma has a physiological, neurobiological effect on our bodies as the person that's feeling shamed, and it causes illness. It amplifies mental health issues. And so I think there's still a lot of work that has to happen around stigma and shame, both for the person who's experiencing it and education for someone who often unknowingly, without information, is stigmatizing someone in a way that's not helping the person that they may really love and care about.
Yeah.
And stigma is one of the significant barriers to help seeking. And so it's going to be hard to deal with other mental health issues unless people feel comfortable self-identifying their challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Thanks for that, Rick. I don't know where our panelists went. I
was kicked off the video.
Okay. All right. We'll bring you back. I know our tech team is working on that. But as we make that happen, I'm going to bring us to our next question, because we were just talking about, there we are. Okay. We were just talking about kind of like the who's included, right? Like, what do we mean when we talk about trauma affected? And I appreciate you bringing your arts practice into this conversation, Christina, because you have these different perspectives that you talked about. And the next question was around some of the approaches that funders can take in supporting some of the intersectional arts and health initiatives. And you talked about Elevate Theater specifically, and also elevating some of the things that are happening, within your theater company, and some of the things that you've gone through personally. And, we've all had interactions with funders. We've got a funder on our call right now. So I would love to hear from all of you, and kick off with you, Christina, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So I mentioned those 3 components that are really for the individual artists. We've seen through our NOAA members, sort of like, where do I find funding that is accessible, easy to identify, and really something that's sustainable, right? And so thinking as funders are thinking about, how they support these individual artists, arts collectives, even artists who are a part of a larger system, but are seeking to expand their practice or learn more, having your information available and readily accessible, but also having it be for multiple years, so that we're not chasing the funding at all times. I think that's a real theme from the membership. It's like, where do I get it? How do I get it? And how do I keep it so that I can continue to do the meaningful and impactful work that is important to me? And then the other really, big element that I would amplify that I mentioned before as well is just this idea of impact. And Rick talked a little bit about expanding the scope, but then narrowing the geographic location, right? Or, funders can get creative in terms of how they're thinking of impact. And does that mean I have served this many people, or does that mean I have been around this long and had this many shows? Or does that mean I've got testimonials from specific individuals who have been impacted by the process of being a part of that arts engagement opportunity. So I think from my perspective, really amplifying the process as well as the impact and outcome of particular work is really an important component and an important distinction when we're seeking funding. I'm not attached to, as an individual artist, or many of the artists that come through NOAA are not necessarily attached to a research lab or something that's larger that they can just mine for all this data and information, right? Artists are expected to have high quality art. They're expected to be entrepreneurs and have organizational structures that match what funders are looking for. And they're also really expected to then be able to seek out, do all of the admin, make sure that, there's 17 different hats that are being put on. And so recognizing that and making things a little more accessible, easier, and expanding that definition of what impact means, I think is really critical.
That's great. Thanks, Christina.
Maybe I'll add to that. I was talking to somebody yesterday, an artist, who said she had hat fatigue, which I thought was great, because it's so true, right? There's so many different hats. I think adding to this idea of what's so beautiful about the three of us is that we all have different perches, but there's a weaving of a nest that we're all creating. And I think it's really beautiful because there's collegiality and connection. So one great example is the NeuroArts Blueprint is creating this resource center that I mentioned earlier. The resource center will have artists, arts organizations, funders, who will have calls for proposal or information about how you can submit for those proposals. So one-stop shopping. And I think that's one of the things, and also tutorials from all the folks that are creating great educational materials about how do you get a grant? How do you move that forward? How do you create sustainability? Having funders and artists talking with each other in very dynamic ways, along with researchers and technologists, because technology is a really catalyzer for a lot of this work. And so we're seeing how that comes together. And then to the point about evaluation, what does success look like? I think for a long time, the bar has been, and the narrative has been through the lens of these very traditional models that don't hold up and they don't solve the problem. And we're asked to carry the ruby slippers and then bring the broom. And yet you're not solving for the problem at hand. So people, when I was talking about ways of knowing, the people that have lived experience, the people that we're working with, the artists that are boots on the ground are the people that need to be creating what success looks like. And I think that's a collaboration and a co-creation with the artists, with the funders, with the communities, and with the researchers who I think have a lot to bring as an interdisciplinary partner.
Yeah, I think that's great, Susan. I want to kick it over to you, Rick, as our funder, and just kind of talk about some of the ways that you have been partnering and kind of respond to some of the things that Susan just mentioned. You gave some incredible examples of the work that you're doing, and I've seen it firsthand. I'm honored. But there's something that you haven't gotten to talk about. And so I would love for you to take some time to share with the folks who are here kind of how you've done that, funder.
Well, for us, I do think it is impact at different levels. And I don't want to impose our definition of success on an organization at the programmatic level, but in terms of what they define as success, I do want to see how they carry that out. And then I do think it's so important that we think across grantees, which might be very different. So we're not looking at sort of one set of measures, but we are looking at how are collaborations being formed? How are partnerships being developed? How is leadership being advanced? And so those, I look at that collectively because we have a portfolio of grantees and they're not just freestanding. I mean, they are freestanding, but we do hope to sort of build a field, as Susan was talking about, and connect the dots.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. It's time for our Q&A. For folks who are here, if you have any Q&A questions for our presenters, you can drop them into the chat. Well, not the chat, sorry, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But I want to, we can remove the slide. I think we're good. So while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I do want to ask, because we talked about shame, we talked about there's different ways of measuring success. We talked about varying approaches, different data that's being used, and just centering the artist, right? And like, how can, I don't want to say should, but how can funders support artists with sensitivity? Just knowing that shame, like, I have this word stuck in my head, shame, but the trauma that folks undergo, right, post the pandemic and even before the pandemic, as gig workers, like, there's just so much happening, I think, at the intersection of arts and health, and there's just it's so important to, I think, handle everything with such care when you're thinking about health and the person and their heart and their soul. So how can this be done with care, with protection, with sensitivity, knowing that the folks who are coming to this, some, yes, may be coming, and for them it's drawing a picture that will inspire, and for other people they're running away from war, right? So what are some of the things that you might recommend that funders think about from all of your perspectives? Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Christine.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Language is important, and we've been sort of struggling with terminology. So whether it's around mental health or mental illness, or is it wellness, or is it mental health challenges, or is it wellness, some of the grantees are not comfortable using words like mental illness or even mental health because of the populations that they're serving. I get that. On the other hand, I feel like we have to name it if we're going to deal with issues like stigma. But language and sensitivity around language is important, and recognizing the sort of where people are coming from and what they're comfortable with.
That's great. Thanks
I
for
would
that.
just add, Sherilyn, you mentioned like centering the artist, right? And so when feedback is provided, regardless of granting funding, regardless of if the funding is granted, I think is a real honoring of that effort towards uplifting a program or an individual artist or a collective's efforts. And so having the opportunity to receive feedback that then allows you to do better the next time, right? And really centering the artist in their application process. This is like sort of a very tactical thing, I think.
Yeah.
But really allowing for that, oftentimes you get hundreds of applications, thousands of applications, and you're not able to give that pointed feedback. And I think the artist is burnt out as well. And so by receiving feedback, receiving information that allows you to then amplify your application the next round, or gives you encouragement around what is good here. And because we don't know what we don't know, right? And it's I mentioned success, if you don't have that building of success in your wheelhouse and you just get a rejection, then you are disheartened and maybe not as inclined to go for funding the next time, which then limits your ability to continue to expand your programs or have vision for the future. So I would just say, feedback where possible is a real key tool and tactical honoring of the artist.
And maybe I'll put at the front end, because I think hearing artist's voice is really important, like to understand what an artist needs in this process. So I think feedback is one of the things an artist needs, spoken by an artist, right? But I think, what are the other things, right? And we don't know because we don't often ask. And so to be able to create the place for artists to share what they want, and because artists are artists, they may not want to tell you, they may want to show you. So, to create a prompt where it's really saying, what would be important for you to feel successful in this work? And we might get drawings, we might get, pieces of music, but I think it's really important to listen to the artist the way the artist needs to share that work, and to grow together. These are relational. When someone gives you an investment, it's a relational it's a relational model. And so I think figuring out how do you, when you're investing in something, you want it to succeed. And so what are the things that are required for it to succeed? And I'll just go to Rick and saying that what Rick does is so beautiful, because the criteria for success is measured, is identified by the organization, and they're required to do the measurement. And so Rick can be an advisor, a mentor, a connector. I've seen him send people to say, get more information about a P&L. You need to understand how to work the numbers, or, you find out what people need, and then you give them what they need, not punish them or penalize them for not having a skill set that's really not their, they're willing to learn, but I think you've got to figure out how to get the resources you need to make your investment really pay off. And I think the multipliers are enormous, and we haven't really even begun to leverage that, because if somebody doesn't have a good year and it's not multi-year, which is another thing, we kind of go, okay, next, right? As opposed to let's go back in.
Yeah, it's tough. And you mentioned something like that earlier, Christina, so I appreciate you bringing that back up, Susan. We've got some questions in the chat, not the chat, the Q&A. I'm mixing everything up. Dina, actually, Dina Bleeker. I'm most curious about the style of work being done by arts organizations, the granting process, arts around healing trauma, the medical health and wellness system, and how cities can design in support of all of this important work. What can be done to bring all factions together in a collaborative way to help lift all efforts? So anyone can respond. Christina, I see.
I was going to say, I'd love to just point to One Nation, One Project as one example of how we're bringing together multiple silos to leverage the arts as a healing vehicle. And so check out our work there, onenationoneproject.com. It's really an opportunity for city government or local government to collaborate with public health, with artists, and in some places this is happening for the first time. In some places this is an opportunity to fortify and amplify those relationships. And in July of 2024, there will be a culminating event where 18 cities across the US will have a expression of artistic engagement that will have all of those different elements present, and they will all be answering or responding to the prompt, no place like home. So it is really an experiment in some ways of bringing together those different elements, different silos, and trying to create long-lasting relationships.
It's a beautiful experiment, and it's also hitting a huge note in a community, right, that maybe has never had art. And this is where a good example is where this community neuro arts coalitions are coming in, sometimes in the same cities, but in other cities, to keep building that fabric around bringing municipalities, public-private partnerships, or arts organizations, cultural arts organizations, artists, schools. And so this is a great example of how these organizations are coming together to create something that's lasting. And I think that's huge. But first you have to have the knowledge of why this matters. And that's what I think One Nation, One Project is really lifting up. And it's beautiful.
That's great. I'm scrolling through our chat and Q&A. I think this is a really interesting question from, I'm not sure if it's Jaime or Jane, but the question is, I've noticed that the term trauma is now used in professional and formal settings more than before. It is now used to describe everything from minor irritations and slights to profoundly harmful experiences that leave people changed forever. How do you like defining trauma in this time when the term's elasticity is being stretched to the limits? And I thought that was a really interesting question, because while it might seem like not, I guess, it's just a matter of, it's like semantics for some people, it is a really big deal. And we just talked about how important language is. So I wanted to elevate this. And actually, I'm going to ask you, Rick, to respond first, because you and I had spoken about language at the very beginning of planning this. So I'm going to ask you to respond first, and then anyone else can chime in.
No, the term has become very elastic, and I think we have to be very clear about what traumatic experiences are for the individual who's experiencing them, and not imposing a label on someone. One thing I would point out, though, is, and you speak spoke about or referred to more sort of the irritations, is even with severe traumatic experiences, about 70% of people who've undergone or who've experienced severe trauma recover just fine. About 30% may develop some aspect of PTSD. And so it's clear, it's important to understand what sort of chronic trauma is, what sort of cumulative experiences are, and to recognize, no, it's not every experience that is traumatic. But when you are suffering, then you need help.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Rick. And before we wrap up, if I can just ask all of you for a quick 30 seconds, no more than 30 seconds, last words that you would like to share with folks who are here, because I do know we have to wrap up. And if I can start with you, Susan, you could give your 30 words.
Yeah, I'll just say arts creates culture, culture creates community, and community creates humanity. And we need it more than ever.
Thanks for that, Susan. Rick?
I would just advise the people who are on the call who are principally arts grant makers, if your foundation or entity has a health program officer, talk to them as well and see where see if there is a nexus or a Venn diagram and opportunities to collaborate. We do tend to work in silos, and I think arts and health gives you the opportunity to sort of break new ground.
All right, great. Christina, bring us home.
I just want to say, I think the arts and health field is so rich with diversity in both the opportunities for engagement in community, but also new art making. And the more we can invest in this intersectional opportunity and field, the better we will be as a nation, as a world, as people.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yes, round of applause to that and all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. You three were amazing. For those who attended, I know there are some questions that have come into the Q&A and in the chat. Don't worry, their email addresses will be at the end of the slide deck that I will be sharing out, and recording of this presentation will go out as well. They are open to you sending them an email, so email them your questions. Yes, send your emails. And I just want to say thank you so much once again to our presenters. If you have any questions about other GIA programming, you can reach out to me, Sherilyn Celia at sherilyn@giarts.org. But otherwise, thank you all for being here. Thank you to our presenters. And don't forget to take the survey that will be in the chat, so you let us know what you think. And I hope you have a fantastic day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Y'all.